Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. My name is Yusra Osman, and I'm the anti-racism specialist at the City of Ottawa. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of Ottawa Public Library and honored to introduce this inspiring event. Before we begin, it is important to acknowledge that the land where most of us are gathered this evening is the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and to express our commitment to continue building stronger bonds of solidarity between Indigenous and Black communities in these lands. The Ottawa Public Library is delighted to be partnering with the Ottawa International Writers Festival for another exciting author meeting as part of our ongoing Black History Month programming. As we know, Black History Month is an occasion to celebrate the many contributions of the Black community to Canadian society. Tonight, it's an honor to have with us Celina Caesar-Chavannes, who is the first Black person elected to represent the federal riding of Whitby, Ontario. She'll be speaking about her memoir and leadership book, Can You Hear Me Now? In her book, Celina digs deep into her childhood and her life as a young Black woman and as an entrepreneur and politician. Her book teaches us how effective and humane leadership is rooted in learning to grow as much from mistakes and vulnerabilities as from strengths. And of course, Can You Hear Me Now is available to borrow from the Ottawa Public Library. I hope this conversation and Celina's work will inspire us all to strive toward a more just and complete vision of leadership and to be of service to our communities. Looking ahead, March is on its way, and OPL will be holding several programs to highlight International Women's Day. Please visit OPL's website for dates and details. Now it is my pleasure to hand it over to Sean Wilson from the OIWF to introduce the moderator and author. Thank you all for joining us and enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Yusra. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe and to the second event of the Writers' Festival's 2021 virtual season. We'll be holding events every week from now until June, all in partnership with the Ottawa Public Library and all free of charge. In the weeks ahead, we'll be spending time with Kahinde Andrews, Koa Beck, Eden Robinson, Andre Picard, Daryl McLeod, Thomas King, and Seth Klein, among others. So there's lots to look forward to. Plus, our podcast, Writers Festival Radio, returns Friday at noon for season 2. We'll hear from Ashley Audrain and Amanda Leduc on Friday. Just like last fall, everything will be available on demand at writersfestival.org. So all you need to do to connect with some of the world's most acclaimed authors and thinkers is visit us online and press play. I want to thank you in advance for joining us and for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, and I know that wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. Please consider making a donation to support our virtual programming, as it may be a while before we're able to gather again in person, and your financial support will allow us to continue to bring you the world's most interesting authors and thinkers. Now it's my profound pleasure to turn it over to our host, CBC's Adrian Harewood, who has been a friend of the festival for many years and is hosting a number of our events virtually again. And let's give a warm Ottawa welcome to our host, Adrian Harewood.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for that very kind and generous introduction. It's always a delight and honor to be associated with the Ottawa Writers Festival. And of course, you know, the Ottawa Library, the Ottawa Public Library is an institution in this city of ours, an institution that I've been frequenting for, well, as long as I've been living, really. So a very long time. So it's certainly, you know, I'm chuffed to have the opportunity to be working with these two organizations. Celina Caesar-Chavannes came to Ottawa and Parliament Hill in 2015 as a political neophyte and left as a veteran of some bruising political battles, but with her dignity intact and her head held high. Celina Caesar-Chavannes says her decision to leave the Liberal caucus in March 2019 had little to do with the SNC-Lavalin scandal and a lot more to do with her anger about the preceding 3 years of Liberal politics in Ottawa. The former Whitby MP left the Trudeau government against the backdrop of the scandal that rocked the Liberal government in 2019. But Caesar-Chavannes says her story got lost in the drama that unfolded around Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott. In her new book entitled Can You Hear Me Now? How I Found My Voice and Learned to Live with Passion and Purpose, she sets the record straight. The book, though, is more than just a recounting of her political journey. It is really the story of her life. Celina Caesar-Chavannes is an equity and inclusion advocate and a former member of Parliament who served as the parliamentary secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Before entering politics, she was a successful entrepreneur. She holds an MBA in healthcare management from the University of Phoenix, an executive MBA from the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, where she also received a Bachelor's of Science degree. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Celina Caesar-Chavannes to Ottawa. Celina, welcome.
Thank you, Ottawa, for having me again. Oh my goodness, it's so great. It's so great to be back, but not so back in a virtual way.
in a virtual kind of way. In a virtual kind of way. Well, no, it's great. It's great to have this opportunity to speak with you, Celina. This book, and I'm going to show it here, and I must apologize in advance because I know there's a bit of a shadow in the camera right now, and we've been trying to fiddle around with it, but unfortunately, we haven't been able to get rid of it. Anyway, let's proceed. So this book of yours, Can You Hear Me Now? How I Found My Voice and Learned to Live with Passion and Purpose isn't what I expected it was going to be. I thought when I opened it, I would be receiving the fairly typical political memoir. This book is a lot more than that. This book, as I mentioned in the introduction, is about a life. There is an honesty about the book. There is a rawness about the book. There is a vulnerability about the book. You take a lot of chances. You take a lot of risks that many political actors in this country might not take. You reveal a lot about yourself in every way. And so I'm wondering, Celina Caesar-Chavannes, why did you decide to write this kind of book? Why was it important for you to write it?
So first, Adrian, let me say thank you for your generosity. I know you haven't even been home yet. I could see that you're still at work. So I appreciate you being here and for this generous introduction. Can I pause for a moment and wait to answer your question as I say thank you to Yusra and to Sean and to the Ottawa Public Library for having me. I will take heed Sean's call and make a donation as I do to my local bookstore. I'll make one to someone local and to a different book list in Toronto that has been very generous with my book. But I want to say that I'm speaking to you from my home in Whitby, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, the Scugog Island, Williams Treaty territory. And I think that's important to do, to acknowledge, especially as Black individuals who are fighting against racism and joining arms with our Indigenous brothers and sisters to fight against oppression. We know when we think about some of the disproportionality in terms of negative outcomes that we have in a number of different systems, that Black and Indigenous people hold those unfortunate numbers together. And so I join in that. You're absolutely right. This is not your typical political memoir, but I'm not your typical politician, Adrian.
Why did you want to write this book? What was the motivation?
Yeah, first of all, I want to acknowledge, the Ontario Black History Society did a campaign a few weeks ago in which they blacked out a history book, one that our children would have at school, in grade school or high school, and they blacked out all the content of this book that was 200 plus pages long. They blacked out everything that wasn't related to or referencing to Black history. And when they finished doing that, it was only about a dozen pages that had any reference to Black history. So one of the primary reasons was I didn't know how history would treat me. I didn't know if history would be kind to me after leaving politics. And so I wanted to make sure that there was an account of what it was like while I was there, but more importantly, what it was like while I was here on Earth as an individual, my story of being an immigrant child and being able to enter into politics. The second reason that I wrote it is that, and the reason that I wrote it the way that I did, and I think we'll get into some of those challenges that you spoke to, was because I think that sometimes we hide our stories, we hide our shame, our pain, our hurts from the world because they are shameful, they're painful, they're hurtful. And I think in this moment in time, coming out of 2020, when people have a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety about COVID, about climate change, and about racial inequality, we need to be a little bit more vulnerable about who we are in order to restore some of those connections and restore some of that humanity that has been lost. And I think that the vulnerability in this book will help to build resilience in other people. And I'm hoping, and what I've heard so far is that people see themselves in the book, and therefore we're starting to build back some of those little fibers, Adrian.
So the book then was about being the author of your own story. It was about shaping your own narrative as opposed to your narrative being shaped by others.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's critically important, right? Like we oftentimes leave it to others to say how our stories unfold. And I think, when historians could write my story, they could write about the accomplishments, they could write about the awards, they could write about the things that I did really well. But I wanted this book to be something that really that healed me, probably selfishly, unloading a lot of the stuff that I had that was buried deep in my heart, that was causing me a lot of pain, but also to heal other people, to ensure that they were able to see themselves in my story, to see that, they're not the only ones that have made mistakes, especially young people, especially when we're thinking about mental illness and we're talking about, suicide rates of young people. I wanted to see that you could survive mistakes. You could do well after you've had shame and guilt, that there is people actually pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and start again. And that's okay to do so.
Mm-hmm. Did you grow up writing or keeping a diary or writing in a journal?
No, Adrian, who had time for that? We had chores to do. We had schoolwork to do.
Yeah. Well, I asked that because do you consider yourself to be a writer?
No, not at all. And no, I don't. I wrote a book. I really have a hard time calling myself a writer in any great sense of the word. Right. I don't know what that. I don't identify with that. I wrote a book.
Mm-hmm.
I don't call myself a writer.
So what was the process then of writing a book? Because you're saying you don't call yourself a writer. What I will say, and as someone who, has the privilege of reading, quite a range of books, as part of my day job, this is a really well-written book. You clearly write easily. It doesn't seem as if you were struggling in trying to string the sentences together. So I'm curious though, was it hard work writing this? Was it easy for you? Talk about the process of actually writing this memoir.
Oh my goodness. I have to give kudos to the people at Random House Canada and to my editor, Anne Collins. The process of writing this book, as someone who was nervous, who's someone who says, I'm not a writer, having someone beside you who says, I do this for a living and this is great. When I handed Anne the first final sort of copy of what ended up being this book, she gave me the greatest compliment and said, this is something that we could just work with. Like let's just go. I'll just work with you as an Anne is like senior in this company. Like she's like boss woman in this company, right? And hearing that, I was like, are you sure? And even if that little bit of imposter syndrome set in, and she said, absolutely, this is a book that is just fantastic. And so having her help me in that process actually allowed for this book to materialize the way that it has. I had great people around me.
Well, you certainly capture our attention from the very first page. And you say on the first page of your book that your first heartbreak came at 6 months when your parents and your older brother Roger left you behind in Grenada in the Caribbean when they emigrated to Canada. And to read that was quite affecting, heartbreaking. Your first heartbreak is when you were 6 years of age. First of all, why did your parents leave Grenada at that moment?
Yeah, so it's not uncommon for parents to leave, children behind to come to Canada. First of all, we have to acknowledge that there isn't a lot of money in Grenada to take a whole family and get a house and relocate. So it's a daunting decision to leave a small island of Grenada that has a population that's smaller than Whitby. I represented Whitby. The population is smaller, the entire country, right? So they left this small island, came here. Their visas came in advance. And having just given birth, of course, my visa wasn't there. They didn't know what they were having, boy or girl. They didn't have passports or anything that I needed to require to get that visa. When their visas came, they came ahead of me. And as challenging as that situation was, and having to acknowledge that, I also acknowledged that that's something that they needed to do. They wanted to make a better life for their family, and I'm here because of the fact that they did it.
And yet, what you say in the book is that it led to, and I hope I'm not putting words into your mouth, but a brokenness in your relationship with your parents. You write, something was lost in my relationship with my parents during those first couple of years, and I felt that loss for most of my life. That's a very, very heavy statement, that you felt this kind of estrangement, this you felt alienated from the people who are supposed to be closest to you, and you felt that way from the time you were a child.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that doesn't make a lot of sense. When you have children, I have children. When I think about not having my children with me from 6 months old to almost 2 years, there would be an estrangement. There would be a sort of reconnection of that loss of a year and a little bit that you can't get back. Those are first steps. Those are first words. Those are a lot of tears. Those are a lot of moments that happen that are lost in that time period. And I think that there's an acknowledgement that needs to happen when and what that means when that time is lost, when periods are lost between child and parent. And it would create that sense of disconnect, that challenge in growing up and in relationships.
How did that estrangement manifest itself in the Caesar household, and how you related to your parents?
Yeah, I was really rebellious.
Shocking. That's shocking. It shocks me. Yeah, it's shocking. Can't believe it.
Can't believe I was rebellious, but I'm so quiet. I'm so quiet and piety.
Indeed. Indeed.
Pious. Yeah, I was rebellious. And the thing I want some of the people who are listening to understand is, when I dedicated this book, I dedicated it to my mother, irrespective of the challenges that we had. My mother and I have had a continuous, challenging relationship, right? But she, I said, to my mother, the iron that sharpens me. And this person that is here in this interview is a manifestation of all of those challenges, is all as a manifestation of all of that iron sharpening that's able to have that resilience to withstand a lot of the storms that I've gone through in my life.
Mm-hmm. This person in front of us is also, or rather modeled herself after a Mrs. Caesar. Who is Mrs. Caesar?
Oh my God, that's my grandmother. That's my paternal grandmother who passed away when my eldest daughter was about 3 or 4. And Mrs. Caesar was the formidable force that was the matriarch, the consummate matriarch of the family. She was the entrepreneur. She was the hustler. She was the original G, and not just G because she was grandma. She was just so amazing. She clapped back before clap back was a thing. You know what I mean?
I had a grandmother like that. My grandmother's name was Inez Pigott, and Inez was a force of nature. Fearsome.
Yes.
Fierce West Indian woman.
Yes, and they are stoic. They are, you know that they love you by the aura that they give, not by the hugs that they give. You know what I mean? They are just so just formidable. And this woman, I would watch her, the way she maneuvered even in her driveway in her village when she was negotiating in Grenville and Grenada for fruits or vegetables or whatever. And I would say, I have got to be her. I have got to be fierce like her. I just, Miss Caesar is a love. She's my love.
Yeah, you say she was everything I wanted to be when I grew up. What are two things she taught you?
She taught me that I think I got my entrepreneurial spirit from her. That ability to adapt. I think the entrepreneurial spirit is one of adaptation, and also the ability to just not take stuff. Every now and again, I think I'm a nice blend between a lot of women in my life. But when I've been pushed to a certain point, the Miss Caesar in me steps in and I'm like, you've done too much. Like Brandon Gomez says, you've done too much, right? And I feel like her presence kind of manifests in me, and it brings out this formidable strength that I don't even know where it's coming from.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a bit about your parents, because your parents, of course, emigrated to Canada from Grenada to work. They went there for opportunity. They were in Toronto at a time that wasn't easy for Black people, wasn't easy for Black West Indian immigrants in the 1970s. Talk a little bit about your parents and what they found, what they experienced in Toronto in those early days in the 1970s.
Yeah, so my parents came to Canada, and the story is they came with, $100 in their pocket. And I remember, I described the story of the haunt, what I call the haunt in the book. Remember my dad, I didn't know what to call it. I didn't know how to name it, but I was a child that was in tune. I used to watch, I used to listen to what people were saying, the way their bodies moved, the way their hands moved, everything about people I was really intrigued by. And so watching this haunt come home with my dad one day from work, knowing that now, I didn't know at the time that racism had affected him in such a way that him and my mom came up with this idea to start a trucking company. And I've told my parents later on in life that I watched everything they did. I watched their hustle. I saw them hustle. I saw them turn that $100 into a miracle of material items, gifts, like things for us, their children. I saw how they invested. I saw how they purchased. I saw how they really made a life for themselves, a legacy for themselves from that moment. And I named the haunt in the book because it was that moment of, I think where I sort of talk about later when I'm in politics, but that moment where they say, no, we are not going to accept this. This cannot be the entire Canadian immigrant story.
Yeah, it's a really powerful, poignant moment, because I think that the picture you paint is that of your father with his face in his hands, and you're clearly a very sensitive, emotionally intelligent child, and you write, I did not want what was happening to him to happen to me. I did not want someone else to use words that made me feel small or inferior. It would be years before I understood that the haunt around my dad was racism, and it was part of the Canadian experience for Black people. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so we don't really talk, and I think we talk about racism as families as something that happens outside of ourselves, but we never really talked as a family about that moment. We never really brought home the examples of what was happening in that moment. And that's why it took me years to understand what was happening to my father in that moment. Again, they're in hustle mode, right? You have to shift gears immediately, or else you're going to get swallowed by the system. And that system could easily swallow you. That racism could easily take you in and swallow you into that system. They shifted gears, and they didn't have a choice. They wanted better for their family. So they shifted gears and decided to do something else, to start a company, to be that entrepreneur, again, stemming from the spirit of my grandmother. And so, that experience, I think, is something that could resonate with almost anybody who reads the book that has a racialized background, where they feel racism doesn't just affect the one person. It travels with you, it comes home with you, it permeates your everything. And that's why, when we talk about microaggressions and racism, that it causes trauma, it impacts everything that you do in that moment and beyond.
Mhm. Desmond Cole talks about the fact that there's a lot of magical thinking in this country, a lot of magical thinking about what this country actually is. Do you think your parents were misled about Canada? Were they misled about what the country actually is as opposed to what it projects?
If I said that they were misled, I would be disenfranchising the story of the fact that they were very successful, right? So I would be discrediting that. So the fact that this country had opportunity, it did. My parents clearly demonstrated that this country had opportunity, and it clearly demonstrated that their children would do better than they did. So that's clear. There's evidence. I can't say that that's not the case. I think where the misleading comes in is the fact that it is not as clear as in the United States or other jurisdictions that racism is so overt. It's a politeness. It's microaggressions. It's unconscious bias. We use these words that sort of dampen what actually is happening. And we need to name it. We need to name anti-Black racism. And I think we don't do that enough. We don't call it what it is. And so, yes, there are some people that are able to navigate it and have success through it and be resilient through the forces of racism that exist, and are able to have success. So this country does offer that. But is there work to be done within this country? Absolutely.
There's a pretty devastating moment early on in the book, and you're talking about your grade 6 self, and you talk about a moment, and it's not entirely clear. It's a bit cloudy, but you talk about the fact that there was, I don't know if it was a boy, I don't know if it was a man, but you say that it was an individual who was much older than you were. We don't know if it's a teenager. We don't know if it's a 20-year-old. But basically, you were sexually assaulted at a young age. Do you feel comfortable talking about that? Because you don't give it a lot of space in the book, but you do reference it, and it's clear that this has been, it was a foundational moment for you.
So I give it the space that it deserves in the book, right? And I don't need to be explicit in terms of who it was or what it was. That part of the book, those couple of paragraphs, were written not for everybody. Those were written for people who have gone through that experience, to have a reference point to know that they're not alone, irrespective of how old they were, they're not alone. Two, that they were never at fault. I actually say that I went back because I knew that I was somehow at fault because I went back. I wrote that in there because I want people to know that, no, you're not at fault. And number three, I want them to know that should never happen to a child. And I start that chapter by talking about the fact that Black women and girls, being born a girl means that you're subject to a whole bunch of things. Being born a racialized girl or a Black girl means that you're subject to a hypersexualization, this subjugation, these disproportionately negative sort of consequences of who you are. And I wrote that section, and I included that section, as painful as it was, in the book, to tell others who have experienced this pain that this pain is not theirs alone to bear. That's it. So I didn't need to give all the details.
If you were to have the opportunity to speak to your she must have been about 11, your 11-year-old self, a self who clearly in the book was forlorn, who was scared, who didn't know what to do, who was on an island having to deal with the situation. What would you tell your 11-year-old self, knowing what you know now?
I'm not sure I could tell her much more. I just tell her that I love her, and that in that moment of absolute torment, that it was not her fault. And there was nothing you could have done more or less at 11 years old that could have changed that situation. And you shouldn't feel guilty about whether you told or didn't tell or anything. This is not on you. It's not on you. And it happened. And now, as my adult self, I'm able to be very conscious of that pain. And therefore, when I advocate for things, when I advocate for my community, when I say I ride for my community, is because I know what that pain feels like. So I will never waver in rattling the cages when it comes to women and girls and making sure they have equity and justice.
I want us to go back to April 1992. The verdict in the trial of the officers who were involved in savagely beating Rodney King. Take us back to that day. Do you remember where you were? What happened that day?
Oh, I was watching it on the television in my living room in Brampton at 77 Newport Street. Maybe I shouldn't have given that address, but anyhow, that's where we live. And I was watching it and sitting on the couch against the wall, like I knew exactly where I was in that moment, and just feeling, there were so many feelings, like lost, hurt, bewildered. I didn't understand. I was.
Didn't understand what?
I didn't understand why it was happening. Like he was on the ground. He was already, like he was covering himself. I didn't understand why it was happening, why they wouldn't stop. So I don't think I'd ever, we heard, I wasn't at that age where, you fully contextualize brutality in the way that our children at that age do it now, right? Where they see everything on their phones. I didn't have a cell phone. Like you got what you got, and mostly what we got was the Cosby Show and like stuff that showed we were allowed to, or Michael Jackson, right? Michael Jackson Pepsi commercials, right? So that I was, what is happening? Why is this happening? How can this be happening to this man? And it was a moment for me.
You were, a lot of people watched that event, that episode, and maybe watched it in their dining rooms, or watched it in their kitchens, or maybe they read about it in the newspapers. But you actually decided to do something about it, and you became engaged in political activity as a result of this. You went to downtown Toronto to kind of check things out.
Yeah, I actually started at my school. In high school, I started at my school, and I arranged a protest at my school, and then I went to downtown Toronto. I heard that Dudley Laws was arranging with his organization this protest, and
we should say, sorry, Celina, we should say that Dudley Laws, who has passed, but he was a very prominent Black activist at the time. He was considered by, I suppose, the powers that be a radical, but he, along with the likes of Charles Roach. No, I'm saying the powers that be.
Oh.
I'm not saying by the community.
Okay.
And I'm well familiar with Dudley, but Dudley Laws, along with the likes of Charles Roach, they were at the forefront of a lot of Black struggles, particularly in the city of Toronto. He was part of BADC, part of the Black Action Defense Committee.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
And so I heard that he was, arranging this protest. I don't know how I heard, but anyhow, I heard. I guess that's the point of the story. I heard, and I asked my mom, can I go? And she was very strict in terms of where I could go and what I could do, and she was like, "Yes, just don't get into any trouble." And that moment, I will never forget it. Like I will never forget getting downtown and being in front of City Hall. And, I was by myself. I took the bus by myself from Brampton to Toronto, sort of, elbowing my little self through the crowd, and then seeing him and being like, oh my God, that's him.
But you know what I'm curious about? Why did you feel the need to be there? Because you were
It's a
what,
moment.
17? You were 17, 18. Not everyone would have the inclination to go. In fact, a lot of people would be scared of going towards a crowd. You went towards the crowd. Why?
It was a moment. It was a moment to be a part of something bigger than myself. It was a moment to add that one woman sort of protest from my school in Brampton to a larger narrative around police brutality, around, no justice, no peace. And I was drawn to it. I was drawn to that civic engagement. I was drawn to ensuring that I was part of a movement that helped our community. It didn't matter that I lived in Brampton. It didn't matter what my parents did or didn't have. I wanted to be a part of something bigger.
Mm-hmm. Why were you drawn to politics? And why were you drawn to run in 2015? Because you say in the book you'd never taken a political science class. You had never been to the House of Commons in Ottawa. You'd never had any real political ambitions. So how did you come to find yourself running for political office in Whitby in 2015?
So I'd be disingenuous if I said I was drawn to it. I actually was taking a political science course in December of 2013 as a part of the Rotman Executive MBA program, and heard my professor talk about political capital and how it could help with some business challenges that you were having. At the time, I was running a national epidemiology study on neurological conditions, and heard the struggles that people were facing, purchasing medication, covering services, people with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, epilepsy. And I thought, wow, I think maybe I could use political capital to help with this. So I became a member of the Liberal Party for the first time in my life in December 2014. I thought I'd just go to a convention, help out and put a few policy ideas forward. And on March 8th, 2014, so less than 3 months later, I got an email that said, invite her to run. Do you know a woman who's interested in running in the 2015 election? And I thought, yeah, I know a woman who'd be interested. I'll do that.
And do you know why? Like what you were just curious, or what was?
No, it was,
draw?
it speaks to sort of opening yourself up to the possibilities that the universe has for you. Like it sounds sort of kind of hokey pokey, but when you open yourself up to possibilities, you just never know what you're going to receive. And I opened myself up to that possibility because in December of 2013, I didn't think that that's what I was doing. My company was doing really well. We had won a number of awards. I was speaking internationally on marginalized people in clinical trials, which is a conversation we're having right now with COVID and hesitancy around vaccinations. And I was speaking about that, and we were doing well. And to leave a company and to go into something totally different, I can't really explain that. I just knew that something intuitively, like showing up at that protest, something intuitively made me feel that maybe this is something I should just try.
And what did you imagine political life to be? Did you have any expectations as you kind of entered into this arena? And you were to be engaged in what some people call a blood sport.
Well, there's no blood. People wear nice suits in politics. There's no blood dropping. But
it's a battle though. And it's pretty vicious.
I don't know who came up with that narrative, but I don't think so. That's not what it's supposed to be. When you're supposed to be looking after the people who need you the most. Governors supposed to look after policy for the poorest and most vulnerable, the people who need that social security net. So I disagree on that sort of blood sport analogy. But
it's not croquet, Celina Caesar-Chavannes.
It's not croquet. It's strategic.
Yeah.
I think it's partisan. I think it's supposed to be partisan to push government to be better, but I think it's become sort of this, the House of Commons is separated by two swords lengths, and we've gotten into this sort of duo kind of mentality where instead of having dialogues around important issues, we're having debates, we're having yes and no's, right or wrongs, instead of having a dialogue about how we could find common ground. And I think that happens a lot outside of what we see in terms of the House of Commons. There's a lot of dialogue that happens. There's a lot of cross-partisan activity. So I I have a very hard time calling it a blood sport.
Okay, but again, that was a bit of it was a metaphor. But what I was trying to suggest, right, was that it's combative and it's tough and it's
Mhm.
bare knuckled and you had to deal with a lot when you entered into that ring. You suffered all kinds of abuses, right?
Mhm.
Whether it was in Parliament Hill itself, but also on social media. The kind
Yeah.
of vitriol, the kind of abuse that you had to endure would make many people crumble. It's not easy. It's not easy stuff.
Yeah. And yeah, so I agree with you there. It was that was challenging. I think it was one of the most challenging, one of the most painful experiences that I've had in my life. You know, it it's not for the faint of heart. So I understand what you're saying. Politics is not for the faint of heart, and politics is certainly not for the faint of heart if you're going to be outspoken. What I expected when I got in there, I was under the impression that I was purchasing what the Liberal government at the time in 2014, 2015, their campaign, what they were selling, which was bold, transformative government done differently. I also heard the words diversity is our strength and, add women, change politics. And I understood that possibly naively to mean intersectional feminist policy. Which maybe is not what it meant, but that's why I interpret it. So I thought we were going to be really bold and open and transparent in some of the things that we're doing, that we would keep the promises that we made in the election.
So that's what you expected. You thought that you were buying into a particular program that had been
Yes,
sold to you and had been sold to Canadians.
sure.
What did you find? What did you find once you entered the Liberal government?
I found, especially in the first 2 years, I was kind of trying to figure out what I was finding, trying to actually analyze whether what I was sensing was actually true and that we weren't being as bold as we could be. And I will want to add that what was sold in the 2015 election was all of those things. But then we were elected with a majority government. So that made me feel like not only are we going to, or were we promising these things, but we could actually do because we have a majority. So what I found was even with a majority government, we were governing with like we took our dentures out, like gnawing at things instead of actually biting into real social issues.
Too timid.
Too timid, not bold, not transformative, not what would be required at the time when you have a majority, not what is required to do, not what is politically expedient, but what will make what will do right by the people, what would create equity within systems that we know are disproportionately negative to certain groups.
So you're saying then that the political leadership and I'll say, Justin Trudeau lacked conviction?
He lacked the capacity to do what was necessary to be done to transform systems, especially things like our justice system, in the way that was meaningful and still does. Yes.
You were his parliamentary secretary.
Mm-hmm.
You say now that you were chosen not because of the fact that you have an executive MBA from the Rotman School of Management, not because you have a health management MBA from the University of Phoenix, not because you have a BSc from University of Toronto New College, not because you were a successful entrepreneur and had been also a civic leader. You say that you were chosen because of your Blackness.
I was chosen because I was Black and because I was a woman, two of my identities. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it's not what
Why is that wrong? Why is that a bad thing to be chosen in part because of a community that you represent?
Oh, it's certainly not bad to be chosen for that. And, one of the things that I said was, I didn't want to be tokenized in that identification. So it's one thing to choose someone because you know that their experience as a Black person, as a woman, or as a Black woman allows a certain degree of value in my ability to navigate systems, and up until this point in my life, and how I navigate those systems add value and therefore is an asset to government because I see things from a different perspective. That's one thing to say, I'm going to choose you as a Black woman because we want to be this bold transformative. We want to repeal mandatory minimums. We want to do these kinds of things. I want your perspective on things. It's another thing to choose someone who's Black and a woman because they are just a Black and a woman. And that is diversity. That is not inclusion or equity.
And
So,
what told you that? What's the evidence of that? Why did you come to the conclusion that you were chosen not because of your proficiency in any particular area, not because of your skill, but because of your skin color, because of your gender?
So in my meeting with him in 2015, I did tell the Prime Minister that I was not interested in being tokenized in this government. This is verbatim. I was more than happy being the member of Parliament for Whitby, and I didn't want to be his parliamentary secretary to fill any gender or racial gaps that he had in his cabinet. He said, for sure, no, you were chosen on merit. Perfectly fine. But at the end of the year in which I was parliamentary secretary, and if people could recall, during that first year of him being prime minister, he did a lot of international travel, quite a bit. And as a parliamentary secretary, not that I need to travel, but you would think that there would be a proportion of that went to his parliamentary secretary to cover ground. That's what you want to do. You want to leverage your parliamentary secretary to cover ground, to make sure that you're adequately covering all the spaces that you need. And what I found at the end of the year, or I didn't find it, what the record will show, so it stays away from me, what the record will show is that I was invited to the state dinner to see Obama. I wasn't invited to the state dinner. I didn't have any meetings. I didn't have any other function there, but to see Obama on the South Lawn on that one day for 15 seconds. Then I was asked to represent the Prime Minister at the opening of the National African American Museum in Washington. Again, there was no other function but me to sit there in my Blackness and in my femaleness, and then to attend the inauguration of President Akufo-Addo in Ghana. And those are three very embarrassingly Black events that I was invited to. Three of them. I was only invited to three in a year.
How often did you speak to the Prime Minister as his parliamentary secretary?
I had a couple of meetings. I had one in August of 2016 and one in December of 2016.
What do you think what did he fail to appreciate about your qualities? What did he and the PMO fail to appreciate about what you had to offer?
That I was smart, that I was strategic, that I ran a successful research management firm, that I understood the intersection of research and business and how biases in research can affect or impact policy, how we can use or leverage research to ensure that we had good policy, how we could marry research and lived experience of people to ensure that our policy reflected not just what the research data was telling us, but what actual Canadians wanted. I think they failed to realize that on more than one front.
You say in your book, I had never felt so much like a woman, a Black person, and a Black woman until I entered politics. Can you unpack that for us? What does that mean?
So in that first year, it was very clear that that my gender and race were being ticked off as, a diversity quota. We have Celina, she's Black, check. She's a woman, check. We got a 2-for-1. I mean, if you actually leverage the experience that I have, my business acumen, my research depth, then you can leverage that for policy, for meetings, for international audiences, for those relationship buildings across the country, domestically and internationally. And that wasn't done. And so it really made it very clear to me how women often feel when their gender is when they experience misogyny, but it also made me very clear as what Moya Bailey describes as misogynoir, as understanding that when you're completely only used for the melanin and the size of your cup size, that no, there's a lot more that we are capable of than just those things.
Mm-hmm. You talk in the book about the daily reality of microaggressions on Parliament Hill, and there's one moment where you reference a particular incident involving a woman by the name of Judy Grant. Tell us a little bit about what you mean by the kind of daily assault of microaggressions that you had to endure in your time on Parliament Hill.
So if Dr. Grant is watching, hi Judy, how are you? So let me just be clear about what microaggressions are. And the American Psychological Association in 2018 produced a report that talked about the trauma that is caused by microaggressions, those daily racist incidents that are death by 1,000 cuts. So whether it is, saying the N-word, big capital R racism, or that sense of unbelonging that people have when they say these things that say, oh, you're being too sensitive, it's just a joke, you need to grow thicker skin. Those microaggressions have an impact on our physical and mental well-being. And so, that incident with Judy, it impacted me as much as it did her. Somebody reaching in and putting their hands through her hair, which I've had whenever I have braids. My hair is this short, tomorrow I show up with braids and it's like, oh my God, how'd your hair grow so long? And somebody just reaches in and pulls their hands through my hair. That is, as far as I'm concerned, as somebody with multiple intersectional identities, as a Black person, as a woman, sometimes I have to deal with sexism and sometimes I have to deal with racism. They're both assaults.
And yet, Celina, there's a generation of folks, probably my dad's age. My dad is 84. He's been in this country since the 1950s. And they're going to say, Celina Caesar-Chavannes, you are soft. You're getting soft. You're getting overly sensitive talking about these microaggressions. If you want to make it in this world, you need to toughen up. You need to develop resilience. This is just the way of the world. We made it through. Toughen up and you'll be okay. Stop dwelling on these microaggressions. You can pass through it.
Am I supposed to respond to that?
You can choose to or not. You can choose to respond or not.
And that's well and good to say. And I hope that people will say that to the American Psychological Association when they say that it causes trauma. But because we are supposed to just dwell through it, it doesn't mean that we don't talk about it. It doesn't mean that there isn't accountability when those things are happening. It doesn't mean that should we also say that when a man sits and squeezes a woman's leg, that she should toughen up too? That she should just accept it? Because honestly, it was just a touch of the leg. It was no big deal. That's why we had a Me Too movement. That's why women do not get believed. That's why we have these moments of these watershed moments when people just say we've had enough. So if nobody's willing to talk about what Black people are experiencing, we'll just keep saying you need to get thicker skin. No, we don't need to get thicker skin. We need to hold the system accountable.
Right. And I raise it, Celina, because in your book, you talk about how, after you decided to leave the caucus, you were approached by an old liberal, a woman, you don't name the person, who confronted you and who basically is scolding you a bit and telling you that you need to get with the program, essentially, and you need to kind of not complain as much as you were complaining.
So to be clear, I was not complaining. I was giving an account of what was happening while I was there. I wanted to make sure that when other young Black individuals, women in particular, walked into that space, that they were not surprised that they were not protected by their title. And so what I told that individual was that even if one person held their head higher in that moment, if one person held their head higher when I talked about them wearing their braids, when I amplified some of the whispers that are never talked about in these spaces. If they were able to do that, then I was perfectly happy, even if it was just one. And because I know there was more than one, I'm good.
Celina, we have a couple of questions from folks who want to get your response. Sarah Onyango writes, "You are so extraordinary, Celina, and voices like yours are sorely missing in our national politics. When you went to DC, did you forge ties with the Congressional Black Caucus? And how can Black Canadian politicians leverage such ties to empower themselves on this side of the border?"
Yeah, so it wasn't until I got into my role as the Parliamentary Secretary for International Development that I went to Washington and I sat with Brenda Lawrence, who is the Congresswoman from Michigan, or Detroit, if I do believe somewhere in Detroit. I'm not sure of her district. I think one of the things that I proposed later on that's not in the book was, especially when the Trump administration came into power, I proposed at the time to Andrew Leslie, who was leading sort of the US exchange, that we should leverage our Black caucus, even as small as it is, to talk to some of the Congressional Black caucus to ensure that we could deal with some of the Trump, where he was saying that putting tariffs on softwood lumber and things like that. Unfortunately, that proposal was not brought forward. You could only really propose. Myself and Brenda, we text back and forth. There's relationships built. I think that there's opportunity to leverage that. I wish that we could have done a little bit more than that. And I think Black Canadian politicians can leverage such ties because there's strength in numbers. And what is happening in the United States is a macro of the micro that is happening here. When we look at our federal prisons on both sides of the border, it's disproportionately filled with Black people. Child welfare services, disproportionately filled with Black children. Education, where we have challenges. I think that there is opportunity to connect. We just need to have the political will to make it happen.
Celina, we have another note here from someone who says, "Any words of wisdom for young Black, Indigenous, or racialized women who are considering running for office? Based on your experience, was it worth it? And would you do it again?"
I'll answer the last question first. Yes, I would do it again. I have had time to reflect, had time to think about things. I wouldn't do it under this current leader. Was it worth it? Absolutely. It was the most painfully beautiful experience that I had. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about using my voice and to be unapologetic and unafraid, to stand in the truth and stand in the power that I have, the knowledge that I have about myself. And what would I say to young Black, Indigenous, racialized individuals or women who are considering, I don't mean to genderify it, but individuals who are considering running for office? First of all, run, show up. Second, call me. I'll help you run your campaign. Thirdly, you know what? Be authentic. If you're gonna be there, show up 100% yourself and smash that status quo. And don't be afraid to get hurt, because when you break glass ceilings, the glass is gonna fall somewhere. And if you're closest to it, you're gonna get cut. So be prepared to get hurt. But if you run in packs, you'll have that squad around you who's able to protect you. So run in packs too.
This is from Paula Bath. She writes, "I want to thank Ms. Caesar-Chavannes for her story and her courage to share her stories. When I read and listen to you speak, I see possibly how your, quote, ways as a politician and ways as an activist can support each other, but also be in conflict with each other. Do you find there is a wrestle between the two?" Those are her words. "Do you mobilize both strategically?"
Yeah, so if you could put them together, you could be a political activist. And I think that that's what I do outside of politics. Wrestling with the two of them inside politics, I don't think it worked very well. And one of the reasons that, in spite of everything else, one of the reasons why I think I had to leave, to be able to rattle those cages a little bit more on the outside. I think the beauty of having the courage to run in the first place is understanding the bounty that exists on the table. the understanding what the table looks like, understanding what the bounty is, so that when the government, puts forward legislation or puts forward funding for communities, and we've seen this a lot in the Black community, $2.5 million announced historically for gender-based violence, to dozens of Black organizations. When I know that in 2018 they gave one organization 3.7 million, I could challenge that. And so I think being a political activist outside of the system, it allows me to do it in a way that rattles the cages, that raises awareness, that pushes against the status quo at the same time.
Celina, I think this is going to have to be the final question, but the person says, "Hi, Celina, great to see you once again, and thank you for sharing your insight with us. What is something you wish you could have done better while you were in politics, and why?"
So in my book, I describe the one thing that I thought I should do is not sort of get wrapped in the fact that I was the only Black woman elected out of 338 members of parliament. I wish that I had connected with other individuals who the only ones, whether that was IT or banking or, whatever, legal, whatever other industry there was. I wish I created that village around me, that squad around me, that allowed me to be a little bit protected, allowed me to feel like I could exchange some of the stories of the things that I was feeling and do it in a way that I didn't have to code switch about it. Do it in an authentic way. And I feel like if I had that opportunity to do it, if I did that better, if I leveraged that better, that I'm not sure if I would have stayed or if I would have left, but I think I would have had an easier go at it.
I want to do a really quick rapid fire thing that I'm just making up on the spot. When I say this name to you, or these names, I want you to tell me what comes to mind. Jane Philpott.
Grace.
Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Power.
Justin Trudeau.
There's no words.
Michelle Obama.
Brilliance.
Barack Obama.
Just amazingness.
And finally, Vidal, your husband.
Just unwavering love.
Celina Caesar-Chavannes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. This was wonderful. Thank you to the Ottawa Public Library. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to, on behalf of the folks who've been watching for the last hour, who have been paying rapt attention to this session, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We do appreciate your patronage. We'd of course like to thank the Ottawa Public Library and the Ottawa Writers Festival, which really is an institution that we all need to support. Try to imagine what the city of ours would be like without the Ottawa Writers Festival, how much poorer we all would be without that vital organization that has done so much for the promotion of ideas, for the promotion of civil discourse, that has allowed us space to reflect on really the human condition. And so, this is an organization that we should always, do our utmost to contribute to and to support, particularly in these times. That this really provides us with a bit of a balm, does it not? And when I say balm, I don't mean B-O-M-B, I mean B-A-L-M. Having an opportunity to commune like this is so vital during these times. So thank you so much. Thanks again, Celina, and we'll see you again, I hope soon. I look forward to our next encounter.
For sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.